This is Detroit, Michigan, one of the many cities that makes the Rust Belt famous. It was once the largest automotive manufacturer in the world and the fourth largest city in the US. Now it's only the 26th most populous city and still losing people and jobs. Other famous Rust Belt cities include Chicago, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Flint, Buffalo, and Pittsburgh. However, not all cities within the Rust Belt are actually rusting. With that being said, let's see which Rust Belt cities are trying their hardest to not succumb to their winter-induced injuries. Before we start, we need to actually define where the Rust Belt is, which is harder than you might think. First off, let's list some states that are 100% realistically and physically in the Rust Belt. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan all fit this category. But you know what's not in the Rust Belt? The subscribe button. Unless you're part of the 20% of my audience from the Rust Belt. Anyway, whether you're from the Rust Belt or not, clicking the sub button is always cool, you know? But anyways, where were we? Oh yeah, defining the Rust Belt. Guess it's time to talk about the states with only parts of the Rust Belt. First off, northeastern Minnesota, mainly around the Duluth area. Next up, eastern Iowa. This contains most of the major cities in the state not named Des Moines. To the south is northeastern Missouri. Basically St. Louis and the small towns along the Mississippi to the north. East of that is a small part of Kentucky. Within this area are the cities of Owensboro and Paducah, as well as the Kentucky side of the Cincy metro area and some areas along the Ohio River. Continuing east is the western and central parts of West Virginia, as well as the northern panhandle. This region is more affected by the decline of the mining industry, especially coal, rather than manufacturing. Now to the north is the western half of Pennsylvania. Not much explaining required here. Lastly, we arrive in New York, where once again it's the western half of the state. Now that we've defined roughly where the Rust Belt is, let's see which cities are coping with the absence of manufacturing pretty well. First off, let's just shout out the entire state of Indiana. Besides the obvious Gary, Indiana, most of the state is actually doing pretty well. Both Indianapolis and Fort Wayne, the two biggest cities in the state, are chilling at a 0.57% annual growth in population, with Evansville, the third largest city in the state, sitting at a more modest 0.14% annual growth rate. Other small cities experiencing growth in Indiana include Columbus, with a 0.55% annual growth, and Lafayette, with a 0.32% annual growth rate. Next state with some solid performances is Wisconsin. Lower prevalence of manufacturing here may have helped cities not be as down in the dumps as the likes of Flint or Gary. Sure, the obvious culprit here is Madison, but it's not the only in the state seeing growth. Standing below Madison's 0.5% annual growth are Eau Claire at 0.41%, Appleton at 0.34%, and Green Bay at 0.28%. With that being said, Indiana and Wisconsin are the only two states in the Rust Belt that have most of their metro areas gaining population. That is, unless you count the one city in Minnesota that's actually worth noting, and that would be Duluth, which is actually growing surprisingly enough. Only a 0.08% annual growth, but that's more than most cities in the Rust Belt, which are declining. Now we head into the state of Michigan, arguably the most famous Rust Belt state. If you were hoping for the likes of Flint and Detroit to show up in the growth list, you would be very disappointed. 4 metro areas in the state are growing at a meaningful rate, all safe distances from Detroit. First city is Midland, Michigan. Not even metro area 10 years ago, this city of 42,000 boasts a 0.16% annual growth rate. Next up is Muskegon on the other side of the state on Lake Michigan. It's technically an extension of another city we'll talk about in a second, but it's still growing by 0.11% each year. What city would Muskegon be an extension of? That would be none other than Grand Rapids, only sizable city in the state growing in population, boasting a 0.28% annual growth rate. However, the last city in Michigan is none other than Traverse City with an impressive 0.48% annual growth rate. Now we move on to Ohio. Before I say which cities are growing, I'd like you to name one of the 3 largest cities in the state. If you pick Cleveland, then too bad, we're not talking about it. And if you were really rooting for Cleveland, then I have some bad news for you. We are actually talking about Cincinnati and Columbus today. Cincinnati is growing 0.24% each year, and Columbus is double that at 0.48% each year. Along with Indianapolis, Madison, and Grand Rapids, this concludes all of the big cities growing in the Rust Belt. Before we get to the final and fastest growing city in the Rust Belt, we must first press F to pay respects to every state which did not make it into the video, despite having cities in the Rust Belt. Sorry, Missouri, St. Louis let you down. Don't worry, you can still blame East St. Louis for dragging the metro area down overall. Sorry, Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh is not strong enough, nor are the other insignificant cities named Erie, Johnstown, and Altoona. Sorry, New York, once again New York City steals all your attention, even though they're losing population too. Sorry, West Virginia, take this as an economic lesson to not rely on one industry, let alone an industry that is known for killing most of the workers before they're even 60 years old. Sorry, Kentucky, Cincinnati's in Ohio. Just because you have part of the metro doesn't mean you get mentioned. Also, your other cities aren't doing great either. And sorry, Illinois, you had the entire state to produce one growing city and you still failed to do that, despite having a crap ton of metro areas. What are you doing, Illinois? Now I give you a second to think, what state did I not mention at all, despite listing it as a partly Rust Belt state? If you said anything other than Iowa, then what's wrong with you? Well, now that we're in Iowa, it's time to reveal which city is the fastest growing in the Rust Belt. And it'd be none other than Iowa City. Great name. But why would people move to Iowa City? Well, the answer lies right here. University of Iowa. That's right, the same place Caitlin Clark dominated in basketball for the past 4 years. Now, what would the growth rate be in Iowa City? 0.67%, which sounds impressive compared to the other 87 metros of the Rust Belt, but it's still slower growing than 108 other cities in the US. It's not even the fastest growing in Iowa. That title goes to Des Moines. With all being said, does this mean the Rust Belt is really dead? Or does the Rust Belt have something exciting coming for it once people realize that the Sun Belt is slowly turning into a functional oven? Only time will tell. That's all, folks. Unless you don't want it to be all. Then you can click this video on screen, which will teach you about useless interstates. Now that's all, folks.